Hi guys, this is Mr. Jones. Today we're going to be talking about biodiversity and some of the benefits that we get from biodiversity. As an overview to this lesson, I'd like you guys to know how we characterize Earth's biodiversity, what are the benefits that we can get from that biodiversity, what are the primary causes of the loss of biodiversity, and how natural background extinction rates compare to current extinction rates. First, we're going to talk about how we characterize biodiversity and get a few definitions. So biodiversity itself is the variety of life across all biological levels of organization. We can start at kind of the smallest level, or genetic diversity. So this is how much variation is there at the genetic level or within the DNA of a particular species. We can also look at species diversity and how many different types of species are there within an area. And lastly, we can talk about habitat diversity, or how many different habitats can we see within an area. Each of these levels of biodiversity come with benefits. So if we start with genetic diversity allows a species to cope with environmental stresses and changes in the environment. Certain individuals in a population may be resistant to diseases or better able to deal with hot and cold, and that difference comes from changes and differences at the genetic level. Species diversity is a type of diversity, again, where we have a lot of different species, and this allows for niche space or individual parts of a habitat to be filled. And when that niche space is all filled, it allows an ecosystem to resist invasive species because there's really nowhere for them to come in, and it allows the system to quickly recover, or more quickly recover, from disturbances. Greater habitat diversity leads to greater niche space, which ultimately allows for more species to exist, and it creates a more stable ecosystem. We also get direct benefits from ecosystems, and we get more benefits from diverse ecosystems. We call those benefits that come to humans ecosystem services, and again, those are any positive benefits that wildlife or the ecosystems themselves provide. We can break these down into 4 different categories: provisional, regulating, cultural, and supporting, and we'll talk about those now. So provisional services are any type of benefit to people that can be extracted from nature. So these are the things we typically think of. We might think about taking firewood to burn in our houses, or maple sap to make maple syrup, wild game that might be hunted, coal that can be extracted from the ground, again, for energy. All of these things are provisional services that are provided to people from the environment. Regulating services can be a little bit more difficult to think about. So these are any benefit provided by the ecosystem processes that moderate natural phenomenon. So you can think about, in this case, a mangrove tree that is holding soil and preventing erosion. You could think about pollination, so insects coming through, pollinating flowers, allowing that process to move forward. Water purification, flood control, even things like climate regulation through carbon storage. So trees storing carbon as biomass, sequestering carbon. Those are all regulating services. Cultural services is the next type we're going to talk about, and they're any type of non-material benefit that contributes to the development of and cultural advancement of people. So this could include things like regional cultures, different ideas that people might have, creativity and recreation that are based in the environment. So skiing in Vermont is a really good example. Even things like leaf peeping, or people coming to look at fall foliage, would be considered a cultural service. And then supporting services are the last type of ecosystem service that we're going to talk about. Supporting services are necessary for the production of all the other services. And what they do is ultimately keep the system consistent, cycling water, nutrients, carbon, and other things, allow all of those other services to occur and ecosystems to function. So biodiversity enhances all of those things, and they wouldn't exist without biodiversity. So the loss of biodiversity is something that may concern us or should concern us. So we're going to look at some of the primary causes of biodiversity loss. Habitat loss is one. This image is showing deforestation in Redonia. You can see roads come in, and as those roads come in, more roads come off of them, and trees are cut both for timber and for agriculture often. This image is showing mountaintop removal mining in Appalachia, where the tops of mountains are blown off to get at the coal underneath, and the valleys below are filled with the material that's taken off the top of the mountain. So it's massively destructive to those habitats. And this is showing urban sprawl in Las Vegas, Nevada. So if you watch, the town grows really rapidly over time, and as it does, even though it's a desert that we're taking over, it's still habitat, and there are still species that will suffer as a result. Invasive species is another big cause for biodiversity loss. So this is a picture of zebra mussels that have colonized on a native mussel. And these zebra mussels grow really quickly, they reproduce really quickly and in massive numbers. So they're able to outcompete native mussels. They clog up our pipes and infrastructure, and ultimately have led to the extinction or extirpation of a lot of native mussel species. Buckthorn is another example. Buckthorn outcompetes a lot of native shrubs, and it has additional negative consequences for the birds who might eat the berries because they process really, really quickly. They have a diuretic in them, which means that the birds aren't able to actually absorb many nutrients because they pass through their systems too quickly. And this last image is of the chestnut blight. It occurred in the United States in the early 1900s and effectively removed one of the most dominant tree species on the east coast of the United States. Another cause of loss of biodiversity is directly overharvesting. So in fisheries, this is one of the most prominent examples that we have. Technology has really outpaced the ability for many of our fish stocks to recover. And so overfishing has led to extinctions or near extinctions of dozens of different species. This photo is of the skulls of American bison. It's a giant stack. And early in American history, bison were hunted as a part of an effort to starve native people by removing an important food source. So this wasn't harvesting for the meat of the buffalo, it was harvesting to remove that meat as an option for native people to consume. Ramps are a plant example of overharvesting. So this is a food that a lot of people forage along the East Coast. It's a garlicky, oniony flavored plant, and the bulb that you see there at the bottom takes roughly 8 years to form. And so when people come in and they harvest large areas of these ramps, it takes a really long time for those plants to regenerate. So harvesting more quickly than the resource can replace itself is inherently unsustainable and will ultimately lead to biodiversity loss. And pollution is the last type, or the last cause of biodiversity loss that we're going to talk about. So everything from oil spills, which impact both terrestrial species and obviously the marine species where those oil spills occur. Plastic is a really huge one. So we have so much plastic pollution in the world, and birds and other animals consume it. They can't digest it. They can't pass it. And in this case, this bird would have starved because its belly was full of plastic and it couldn't eat anything else. This is salt damage on some cedar trees on the side of the road. So as the plow trucks come and they remove snow from the roads, that snow is often salted, and that salt hits those trees and damages the trees. And then the spraying of pesticides and herbicides is another issue. It's both intended to directly kill species, but also there are a lot of unintended victims of that spray as well, whether it's amphibians and insects in the water or other insects that were just non-target species. Climate change, this is the real last one, is clearly a big cause of biodiversity loss. Everything from the melting of the polar ice caps and the reduced extent of polar ice caps, which ultimately both removes habitat for animals like seals and polar bears, but also increases the rate of warming by reducing the area that reflects solar rays coming in from the sun. Corals are also victims of climate change. We can see that directly through events like coral bleaching. Coral bleaching occurs as a result of warm water and decreased pH in the ocean. All of these things that lead to biodiversity loss, we can see, we know that it's bad, but it's also important to know that extinction is normal. 99% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. And the background extinction rates are about 1 species per year for every 1 to 10 million species that exist, which there's a big, that's a big broad range. But we can still see trends with that variation. Current extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times greater than that baseline rate. And you can see in this graph, as the human population, which is in purple, has increased, the rate of extinction, which is in green, has also increased at a slightly lagged pace. And they've been tied together by dozens, probably hundreds of scientific studies. The Earth has undergone 5 mass extinctions that we know of based on the fossil record, and it looks like we may be entering a 6th mass extinction, especially if we continue to do the things that we're doing. So as a review, I want you to think, do you know how to characterize Earth's biodiversity? What are the 3 ways that we characterize biodiversity? What are the benefits of those? Can you think of the 4 different types of ecosystem services, as well as what the different levels of biodiversity provide? Can you list the primary causes of biodiversity loss? And do you know how background extinction rates compare to current extinction rates? If you don't, I would recommend going back and watching this video again, but I hope you found that helpful.